Hello, today is Wednesday, September 11th, and welcome to episode 358 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI Senior Fellow Lester Munson, and I'm joined today by NSI Fellows Jessica Jones and Matt Hayden, NSI Visiting Fellow Amy Mitchell, and my fellow Senior Fellow, Jeffrey Wells. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to remember the 23rd anniversary of the September 11th attacks in 2001 and talk about how they're still impacting American national security. For our younger listeners and viewers, nearly 3,000 Americans were killed 23 years ago in a terrorist attack involving 4 airplanes that were hijacked, crashed into the World Trade Center, into the Pentagon, and into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The U.S. almost immediately went to war in Afghanistan, seeking the perpetrators of these horrific acts. Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. The Congress passed an authorization for the use of military force a week after the attacks, one that is still in use today as we, the United States, are pursuing adversaries in Iraq and Syria that are related to Al-Qaeda, the organization responsible for these attacks 23 years ago. So this is something that is still very much pertinent to what the U.S. is doing today. Matt, I want to go to you first, talk about the historical precedent of what happened a generation ago and how we're still dealing with it today.
Yeah, a lot of what Americans felt before that day was that military conflict was happening all around the world and that it was largely a military affair. You had DoD doing DoD things all around the world, and as adversaries propped up, the U.S. government measured and responded. This brought conflict to our shores in a way never before. We did have Pearl Harbor in World War II, but there was not a continental U.S. attack that looked like this, that felt like this, that had a large list of casualties that led in a way to where domestic citizens now were intrinsically involved. And so it shifted the mindset of Americans from we are a preeminent superpower in the world that is going to deal with other superpowers in a military and diplomatic way to there are not stateless actors that will try and take out our way of life. And so that's what built us to where we are today in a lot of our processes and systems, which candidly keep us able to inform the American people of who has bad intentions out there outside of our scanning universe and keeps us in check. And it also kind of gives us a perspective of how others may try to abuse our systems we have at home. And we're seeing that with things like cyber as well as trade. And you're seeing that from not just stateless actors, but all the way up from the current 4 big adversaries today.
Amy, I'm interested in your thoughts about how maybe the current generation of Americans thinks about 9/11 and the U.S. role in the world.
Yep. So, 23 years ago, I was in Arlington and felt the plane hit the Pentagon. Back then, we only had TV to get our news. Most of our communications were down. And, having worked at the Pentagon on the September 11th memorial for a number of years and interacting with the people in the building who had come to the rescue, that had been in that ring, and how deeply they felt it. And today, we see with the Israeli and Palestinian protests happening around the country and around the world, that there isn't a good sense of history anymore. And shared history is really kind of one of the hallmarks of a democracy. And that is troubling to me. I recently met a young woman who had visited Hawaii and told me that she had gone to a place on Oahu where there had been a war at one time, referring, of course, to Pearl Harbor. But there was no cognizance around what that meant and kind of the implications of World War II, again, going back to Israel and why Israel was formed, right? And so if we kind of lose that that sense of shared history that we're seeing in today's generation, we will have this divisiveness and fragmentation of our society. And to me, that's one of the most important keys to this is, you know, Matt just said, DOD doing DOD things. I think that that's kind of the viewpoint of most Americans, right? Is that, oh, we have DOD and DOD does DOD things. We don't really know what that is. And there needs to be this deeper knowledge. And I'm hoping that parents out there today are really teaching their kids more about these kind of seminal events that have traditionally brought Americans together and through unity. And you remember those days right after 9/11, you know, driving through Arlington, the number of flags hanging off of overpasses and on people's houses. And, I think in a lot of parts of the country that still exists. I just drove cross country actually. And it is heartwarming to see how many Americans still have flags out and, kind of are proud, but we need to make sure that we know what we're proud of.
Jeffrey, as a fellow senior-ish American, what are your thoughts about the way people think about these things today?
I thank you for those kind words.
My brother.
It is. I think back on September 11th, 2001. I was on a plane flying to New York City, and when at 8:46 a.m. when American Airlines Flight 11 hit the first tower, my flight was diverted, and I just remember sitting on the tarmac wondering, wow, what a weather event, because they didn't tell us anything. We didn't have smartphones. And I remember when I did find out what happened, as they deplaned us with all these other planes and saw the images on TV, I remember kind of just saying, our world's about to change in ways that we can't even understand, because, as Matt said, the homeland, our country's been attacked, and as time has gone on, I served in Iraq, Afghanistan. I fought in the war on terror, and it's not over. As much as many would like to believe that, in August of 21, when we withdrew from Afghanistan, that it was over, and it's not. And I'd say the world is unfortunately kind of looked at 9/11, the memorials, the activities that take place each year have kind of just gotten a little softer, and it's just begun, as Amy said, kind of relegated to a very simple aspect of American history. It's a couple of lines now in a book, and we've got a generation that's that is 18 years old now, that's able to vote, and they don't understand the context of what happened, because we don't have this detailed understanding from a historical perspective, and it's putting it into the context of what's happening in the world right now. And I think that we're seeing recidivist ISIS-K, we're seeing Al Qaeda, the Taliban operating in places, and you've got two global wars at the conflicts at the moment with major players, and I think that it's just perhaps too much to gather from your phone to understand and comprehend what really happened on that day, and then our quest for vengeance kind of led to 20 years of fighting an asymmetrical war that's left us in a very unstable world at the moment. And I can't believe I'm saying that as a veteran, but it's just, I didn't think this is where we'd be in 2024, where you have to really sit down and explain to this new generation of officers, or military, or college students, what happened, and it's I think our democracy was attacked on 9/11, and I think it's just as true today. We just have different risks, but we need to be leaning in instead of pulling back out and trying to protect ourselves. We need to
I
be
want
present in the world.
thanks, Jeffrey. I want to drop a pin in that not pull back concept. But Jones, I want to before we explore that a little bit more, I want to go to you and maybe talk about how you see these issues from 9/11 playing out in today's challenges.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the Americans seem to be a little bit more clear-eyed about the dangers in the world and the numerous dangers, and that can be from emerging technologies, that can be in new domains like cyber. It doesn't mean they understand the intricacies of what those dangers are, but they understand there's attacks that maybe bring down utilities, right? We've got Russia invading Ukraine. Do we have to explain why that's dangerous to Americans and our world order? Yes, but they understand that there's an old superpower that is attacking another nation. There's more consensus or understanding of the threat coming from China. No longer do people think it's a peaceful rise of a new world power. And so I think there's a growing sense that the world is dangerous, and that there's these other vectors of threats that they may not have thought about before. I do think, though, to Matt's earlier point, what I think 9/11 really, this feeling of retrenchment, and even though there's awareness of all these threats in the world, a feeling of kind of trying to pull back, though, I think 9/11 really made people wonder, if we are this huge superpower after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're the only power left standing, but we're not secure at home. Like, what's the use of being a superpower, right? If we have to worry about threats throughout the homeland. And I think that feeling it seems as if that's one motivation to have people pulling inwards, right? And really worried here about what's going on the domestic front. And it's much easier to focus on what's going on, how you're going to pay your bills or your children's childcare, than it is to wonder what it means abroad. So there's this feeling of kind of pessimism and disengagement. But I think when it comes to folks who have not lived through 9/11 or not old enough to remember, I worry less about that, though, I guess, because there are all of these seminal moments throughout American history that you are not able to experience, right? Whether that's the Civil War, whether that's Pearl Harbor. We talked about the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And after a lot of huge moments in American history, there are moments of unity, but there's also division, right? There are tough conversations happening after these cataclysmic events. And I think we should also focus on that. And so I think, yes, we need to be educating people what 9/11 is, what it means for American history, what it means for American foreign policy moving forward. But I think this feeling of, I don't get pessimistic that there isn't a feeling of unity in America, because we get further away from 9/11 and there's people alive today in roles that are important that didn't live through it.
All right, I'm gonna throw a little spanner into the works here and try to connect it to the debate we heard last night between the two presidential candidates. Plenty of folks have talked about Donald Trump and his version of isolationism and desire to pull back the U.S. role in the world. Some of it is acutely good analysis. Some of it, I think, misses the mark. He is definitely not the traditional international-minded Republican. But something that concerned me even more last night was Kamala Harris saying that no Americans are serving in harm's way effectively in the world right now, and also doubling down on the Biden administration's rather terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan. And this comes 2 days after the administration floated the idea that all U.S. troops are going to be coming out of Iraq within the next couple of years, which I don't think is going to happen. I think was a political move, as we discussed 2 days ago on the podcast. But I don't think either party is really owning up to the challenges we have in the world right now. And so, Jones, you talked a little bit about, lack of unity and divisiveness. I'd like to see a little divisiveness. I'd like to see one of the parties step forward and say, here's what our proper role in the world should be. And it might be a little more aggressive than you want, but that's what's in our interests. And our values, kind of follow along with that. Instead, I think both parties are trying to get by with, we can safely withdraw from the world, or at least make it look like we are, and not really prepare the American people for the burdens of leadership and the responsibilities that we do have in the world. I don't know if that's like necessarily a great reflection on the events that happened 23 years ago. I'll just for folks who are kind of getting a little, sentimental or thinking back on history, there were My wife was in the air when 9/11 happened. I was very worried about what plane was that had actually hit the buildings. Was she okay? Two of our neighbors were airline pilots for a major airline. We were worried about whether they were on the planes. And I can remember, just for the next 3 or 4 days after the attack, really thinking that almost anything could happen and we needed to be ready. And I had a little kid at the time. And anyway, it was an earth-shattering, kind of a reality-shattering event, at least for me, and I think for a lot of people in our country. Does anyone have final thoughts before we close this one out?
I will say, just as not a senior fellow on the podcast right now.
Jones, you are our newest fellow.
NSI's
newest fellow.
If you think it's interesting, I've reviewed so many cover letters and resumes for whether it's interns, research assistants, staffers, and the amount of younger generations interested, though, on the global war on terror and in counterterrorism issues is actually really high. If we want to just speak, in function area or a region of the world, there is still, at least from, and I get that that's a bubble of people applying to be in national security field. There is, I was actually quite surprised, like happily surprised at the number of people thinking about these issues, talking, because I think their parents their parents were impacted by 9/11. And so that impacted them as children. And so they might not have lived through it, but they've reflected on it and their lives have been different. And so I think there really is, at least there is a cohort of people still really focused on the issues that directly impacted and drove 9/11.
Yeah, I'll agree with you on that, Jessica. Is that, I am I'm an optimist when looking at the next generation and then perhaps a generation after that. There seems to be a heavy values-based interest in things, and from both from a national security, from internal threats as well as external threats, and how they can actually play a role in that. And they're eager to sit at the table and be part of those conversations rather, sitting on the back bench. And so that gives me great hope. But as a fan of history, I do wish, that perhaps we, would maybe put it in civics, but put it into a greater context rather than just sort of a paragraph in a history book that says, this happened. And, then there was a war and we won the war. Things are simple. I'd like to spend a little bit more time contemplating and discussing in a Socratic method.
Les, I'm going to take the more pessimistic view. Sorry,
That's fault lines.
I don't disagree, Jess, that there are people that do deeply care. But I think after the Afghanistan evacuation, you saw it in poll numbers, right, for Biden for the last 3 years, this visceral reaction that he hit something that we left Americans, we left chaos, and this is not what America does. And my greater concern is that the younger generation is okay with that they're okay with America being, not a global leader, kind of this country. And I think that one of our strengths is that we are different, right? That we have these rights embedded, and that we have this common theme throughout history that we do the right thing. And right now we are on the precipice again of not doing the right thing in so many different circumstances, and that we have this next generation that's okay with that is my fear. So sorry to be the Debbie Downer this morning.
Matt, we'll give you the last word.
I was about to say that's a tough one to follow. I'm routinely the opposite of a pessimist, but strongly a realist. So it puts me in kind of the same corner. The challenge we have is that you have a real world society that doesn't care when you explain how China might be taking their data from their phones. They'll look you straight in the eye and say, well, who cares if they have it? I mean, there's those types of conversations where you're trying to explain that there are those that don't have your best interest at heart, and that we have the ability through diplomatic, economic, and national security means to maintain an order, and that order makes us all work better. If the whole world is spinning at the right speed, we can sell American innovation and prosperity around the world. And when it starts to get out of hitch, that's when we have a problem. And we don't speak like that when we talk national security. We really talk about the challenges of things go boom. And so when we start to engage with the newer generations that haven't lived through some of these events, you really have to put it in a more marketable sense, I'm afraid. And so what we're finding is that when we're working with the new bench for national security folks, and to Jessica's point, there are new people rushing in to be national security professionals, but their perspectives are really limited to what the old guard and those around them share with them, as opposed to this really robust American culture around national security. So it is something that is fragile. And so it does require some gatekeeping. And candidly, in this world where talking points can last 10 years or 2 seconds, you do have to work with equipping national security professionals to say, look, my job not only matters to keep this big bad thing from happening, but in the whole litany of this elongated dance of society, if we don't have it, that chaos really is going to mess your world up. And that's part of the issue that every 9/11 anniversary brings, as we look at the way DHS is structured and the challenges. Every year, we're trying to make sure that's right. And the homeland protections and the balance of privacy and vetting. At the same time, you can't throw that baby out with the bathwater. And so there is a need to make sure that the best case scenario is being put forward.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. That's a wrap. Thanks to Devlin Burney, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Friday, September 13th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. Fault Lines is on YouTube. Check out our channel there for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.